Hello and welcome to the Revised Common Rule webinar series. Today's webinar is Revisions to Definitions. I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation is based on the original CITI program final rule resource, Revisions to Definitions, authored by Gary Chadwick. I will be presenting the webinar today. My name is Margaret Rankovic and I'm the Associate Director of Educational Initiatives at the CITI program. Today's presentation aims to review the revisions to the definition section, Section 46.102 of the Common Rule. While the CITI program recognizes that each Common Rule agency has different citations for its human subject protection regulations, for consistency and clarity, this presentation will use citations to HHS 45 CFR 46 Subpart A version of the revised rule. I'd also like to note that this presentation is for educational purposes only. You need to consult with your organization's policies and procedures, as well as the applicable Institutional Review Board for specific guidance for implementing the Revised Common Rule. There's flexibility built into the implementation of the Revised Common Rule, so it's extremely important to check with your reviewing IRB and your institution to see how they are implementing the requirements. The topics we're going to cover today are review major changes to Section 46.102 of the Revised Rule, identify new terms added and review their definitions, discuss updates to the definitions of existing terms and potential implications for research, and list new terms added in the revised rule but not defined. First, let's quickly review what is the revised rule. The Revised Common Rule, also called the 2018 Requirements, Revised Rule, or New Rule, replaced the pre-2018 Requirements version. The pre-2018 requirements is also referred to as the old rule or the previous rule. And it's important to know that research approved on or after January 21st, 2019 is subject to the 2018 requirements, the revised rule. These revisions aim to better protect human subjects involved in research, facilitate research, remove ambiguity, and reduce regulatory burden. Let's start with our first topic, a review of the major changes to Section 46.102 of the revised rule. So what were the major changes? Definitions have been reordered alphabetically to make it easier to search and find terms. There were 3 new terms added: clinical trial, public health authority, and written or in writing. Some terms were also revised, including legally authorized representative, human subject, and research. However, most terms remain unchanged. The next topic we're going to discuss are updates to the definitions of existing terms and the potential implications for research. Before we start looking at the revisions, it's important to note that some definitions were not changed, and these include key terms such as IRB, IRB approval, and minimal risk. The first big updated definition is human subject. Here's the new definition of human subject on this slide. The pre-2018 rule referenced data, however the 2018 rule changed to information and biospecimens. The explicit reference to biospecimens in this context is intended as a mere clarification of the previous understanding of how the pre-2018 rule operated. So question, does this revised rule expand the definition of human subject? No, this definition is basically unchanged and definitely not expanded. The clarifications to wording make explicit the regulator's current interpretation of the definition included in the pre-2018 Common Rule. So, what are the triggering events for this definition? When we look closely at the definition, you can see that the trigger events at 46.102E12 are obtaining, using, studying, analyzing, or generating identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. These triggers have been added to clarify the meaning of obtaining from the pre-2018 Common Rule's definition of human subjects. So now we know better what is meant by obtaining. We're moving on now to our fourth topic, list new terms added but not defined in the revised rule. It is important to take note of terms used in the revised rule that are not defined, as word selection and usage are extremely important in regulations. It can be challenging trying to determine how the federal regulation is using a term and what the significance or meaning is and how it is applicable to research practice. There may be clues in the context of the regulation when the term is used, how it is used, and sometimes an explanation is provided. Also, federal guidance can help provide direction on how to understand and comply with undefined terms in research practice. The definition of vulnerable is not included in the definitions section, but it has been updated in both 46107, the IRB membership requirements, and 46111, the criteria for approval of research. Adopting a suggestion from the NPRM public comments and the SACARP, the final rule no longer includes pregnant women or handicapped and physically disabled individuals as examples of populations that are potentially vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. The revised rule uses the term individuals with impaired decision-making ability to replace the term mentally disabled persons. So in looking at this revised definition, the vulnerability of subjects in research studies should be considered as a function of the possibility of coercion or undue influence. This type of vulnerability alone should be the IRB focus of concern in determinations about vulnerable populations. Now we've reached the end of the presentation, and I'd just like to conclude with a few last thoughts. First off, definitions are super important. How terms are defined really do affect policies and research practice. Looking at the revised rule, these changes are meant to increase protections for subjects. So updating the concept of vulnerability, for example, provides an extended view of group and situational potential vulnerabilities. Revisions are also meant to facilitate the conduct of research. Changes to definitions make more activities outside the scope of the rule, for example, by saying what activities are no longer considered research and no longer governed by the common rule and IRB review. The changes also make it simpler for some things, like to use a legally authorized representative in research or electronic forms. And some terms are not defined on purpose to allow for flexibility. Clarifications to major terms like human subject and research are meant to resolve the ambiguity from the pre-2018 rule and really facilitate research review and conduct. Now there's more clarity on what the regulations mean when they say obtain or on what activities are not considered research. Thank you so much. I hope this revised Common Rule webinar on the revisions to definitions was helpful and informative for you. Thank you.